The remaining part of this chapter is more about the chemical signaling or the neurotransmitters. So we saw already that the sympathetic nervous system, we are going to have always acetylcholine, and the acetylcholine always is going to be stimulatory. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, we saw that at the ganglion we are going to have ACH. However, the difference will be on the postganglionic axons. So in the sympathetic, we said we are going to have norepinephrine, whereas in the parasympathetic, we are going to have ACH, and we said the effect is going to be dependent on the type of the receptors. Let's see now the classes of the neurotransmitters. The synapses of the autonomic nervous system can be classified as cholinergic or adrenergic synapses. The cholinergic would release acetylcholine, whereas the adrenergic would release norepinephrine. Remember that this was very similar to the types of receptors in chapter 12. We said the cholinergic receptors would always bind to acetylcholine, but we did not talk so much about the adrenergic receptors. For the cholinergic system, if you remember, we said we have two classes of receptors. We have nicotic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Usually these nicotic receptors are always stimulatory, and we said this is the type of receptor that we can find at the neuromuscular junction, whereas the muscarinic receptors could be inhibitory or excitatory depending on the receptor of the target organs. So if you remember, we said ACH on skeletal muscles will open sodium gates, and this would lead to contraction. So this is a stimulatory effect. Whereas the same ACH on the cardiac muscle would open the potassium gate, and this will cause relaxation in the cardiac muscle, which is inhibitory effect. The same ACH. So it depends on the receptor. For the adrenergic system, also we have two types of receptors. We have alpha receptor and beta receptor. And usually the cells of these organs would display the two types, alpha and beta. However, we have subclasses of each one. So we have alpha 1 and alpha 2, whereas beta, they are just 3, beta 2 and beta 3. So each organ or the surface of the cells could display, for example, alpha 1, beta 2, alpha 2, beta 1, and so on, for all of these different organs. And each combination of these receptors would lead to a different signaling inside the cell. So it depends when the neurotransmitter, which is in this case epinephrine or norepinephrine, when it comes, it depends on how many of these receptors are available. That will determine the effect on the target organ. So let's say, for example, that alpha 1 beta 2 is going to be stimulatory, whereas alpha 3 beta 3 always going to be inhibitory, just for the sake of example. And let's assume that this organ or this cell has at certain point most of its receptors are the alpha 1 beta 2, alpha 1 beta 2, alpha 1 beta 2, and so on, versus like just one alpha 3 beta 3. So when the norepinephrine arrives, it will bind to more alpha 1 beta 2 receptors. This will cause the effect to be stimulatory. After 3 hours, for example, it could be flipped. It could be that most of these organs or most of these receptors are alpha 3 beta 3. So when norepinephrine arrives, it will bind to the dominant one, which are the alpha 3 beta 3, which will cause the cell to be inhibited. So it depends on which subtype of the receptor is dominant on the surface of the cell or on the surface of the target organ. The autonomic tone, we said this is a result that both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are sending thousands of action potentials to the same organs at the same time. And usually, this will determine the state of the system. Yes, we said in general that sympathetic is for fight or flight, okay? but this does not mean that it's always stimulatory. We will see later some examples that for the sympathetic division, for the fight or flight response, we need to inhibit some organs from working. And the same situation for the parasympathetic. Yes, we said this is for the rest and digest, but this does not mean that it's always inhibitory. We need for rest and digest to stimulate some organs. So there are two different things happening here. Sympathetic is not always activating. Parasympathetic is not always relaxation. Okay? Keep this in mind. So at each target organ, the dual innervation determines the activity. And we said if the parasympathetic is sending more action potentials, this means that the body in general will relax. Or if the sympathetic is sending more action potentials, then the body in general would prepare to spend energy. So which means, in general, that the balance of homeostasis is a competing effect from sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Again, which one is dominant will determine the state of the body. So here, the parasympathetic division promotes maintaining functions, conserves energy, whereas the sympathetic would mobilize the body during activity. So here are some organs and how parasympathetic or sympathetic divisions affect them. So for example, for the eye, the iris, the parasympathetic will constrict the pupil, meaning it will reduce light coming to eye, whereas the sympathetic will dilate the pupil. Think, for example, if you are going to a fight or you are feeling stressed about something, you need your eyes to be maximized open so you can see more. Whereas if you are relaxed and you want to sleep, your pupil should reduce the amount of light. So this is the effect on the eye. For the glands, it depends on the glands. Sometimes the parasympathetic is secreting or stimulating secretory effect. This is a stimulatory effect, although we are doing it for a resting state. Whereas the sympathetic, it will inhibit the secretory effect. Why? Because it needs to preserve the energy from these glands and provide it, for example, and provide that energy to the skeletal muscles. Most likely that's where the energy is needed now. So they need to spend energy in areas that we don't need it for a stress response. See, for example, the heart. The parasympathetic will decrease the heart rate. The sympathetic will increase the heart rate. Urinary bladder. Usually you would go and urinate when you are relaxed. So this will cause the bladder to contract. So this is a stimulatory effect and this will promote urination. Whereas if you are going to fight, you don't need to urinate, right? There is no time for that. So your bladder would relax. This is inhibitory effect. So you see, that is what I was talking about. That parasympathetic does not always mean it's inhibitory. No, it depends on the organ. And in general, to go over all of these lists, you can always think that if I'm going to a fight, which organs I need for a fight? Do I need my stomach? No. Do I need my lungs? Yes. Do I need higher heart rate? Yes. Do I need, for example, intestine movement? No. And things like this. For the liver, it will increase glucose uptake from the blood. So it will preserve them. For the sympathetic on liver, it will cause the release of glucose to blood. Why? Because you want the energy, and so on. There is this link. You can open it and watch the effects of these divisions on different organs. I will not play it on the video. You can download the slides and copy and paste this into your browser and you should be able to get it. In general, these are the organs I want you to know. The list is much longer than this, but at least these are the organs that I want you to know and know their effects based on the sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions. These two slides are just a summary of what we talked about. Let's see now how the CNS and specifically the brain controlling the autonomic nervous system. In chapter 13, we mentioned the hypothalamus has three major functions: the homeostatic functions, the autonomic functions, and the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is receiving different information from different regions of the cerebrum, and it will make a decision about them and then send these decisions through two pathways. One pathway is the orange line, which is called the medial forebrain bundle, which goes to the frontal lobe, to the occipital lobe, and so on. And also it goes down to the spinal cord. And then there is another road, which is the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, which goes, as you can see, to the pons, to the midbrain, and to the medulla oblongata. and affects them. Remember the pons and the medulla oblongata, we said these are important for the cardiovascular and respiratory system rate. This is how the hypothalamus is affecting them, which will set the tone of these systems. With that being said, we need to remember that the hypothalamus is making these decisions based on the sensory information it's receiving, right? So it receives all of these different information and it deals with them and make decisions about. But sometimes these sensory information are not coming because of external factors. These are coming from internal factors. Importantly, sometimes even emotional factors. So one major component of this limbic system is its involvement in the emotional responses. And how does it contribute to the memory? So for example, you can remember a happy moment and you will feel your body responding in a very nice way. At the same time, you can remember a bad memory and maybe you can start crying because of that bad memory, right? So all of these different things happened here in the brain and affected the hypothalamus, which means that there is no external factor contributed to the state of the body. This can be all manipulated just based on your emotional state and based on the memory are engaged or involved in making these decisions. And this might lead to a fight or a flight response. Now, I don't want you to go too much into the details of this, and I don't want you to talk about the amygdala and so on, all of these different parts. Just understand that it is the hypothalamus, and understand that this can be affected also by thinking, by emotions, by thoughts, not necessarily as a response to external factor happening outside the body or even related to a homeostatic issue. So this will conclude this chapter, and this will conclude the course itself. Thank you.